Bolivia is currently a landlocked country, but it wasn't always a landlocked country. I thought I would start this section on water and conflict by talking about something that none of the readings talked about this week and that I really don't think the literature has paid that much attention to, and that is water as a strategic asset, not necessarily for consumption, but for exporting goods and for ease of transport. And the war in the Pacific of the 1870s between Chile and Bolivia is one of those examples of countries losing their access to water due to conflict. I think Ethiopia and Eritrea would be the only other example that I could think of that. But basically in 1874, 75, Bolivia and China signed a boundary treaty. A couple of years later, Bolivia started to charge an additional tax to a Chilean mining company in Bolivia. Chile wasn't too happy about that. Bolivia didn't back down. And when Bolivia seized the assets of the Chilean mining company a few years later, the Chileans invaded and took over one of the seaside ports of Bolivia, Antofagasta, which kind of started this slow losing of territory in access to the ocean in a couple of different wars in the 1870s and in 2000 and in the early 20th century. And this is something that hasn't necessarily been forgotten. When I went to Bolivia a while ago, you can see this monument there in Copacabana that was once lo que un día fue nuestro, nuestro otro día será. Once what was one day ours will be again. And I've never seen someone quite stabbed with a bayonet as dramatically as in this statue, but it is kind of a marker that kind of shows how water can be, and access to it can be related to conflict, but one in which we haven't really talked about and I don't think we will talk about later in this term, but that the importance of access to seaways can be crucial for development. So how can water be related to subnational conflict? I think the readings talked about some possible causal processes that water can accentuate societal divides, tying it back to how the pie was divided back in week 1 and week 2, that certain groups like the agricultural producers in Central California can have more resources than the masses that might be less economically powerful in the urban areas. Human suffering and grievances and the grievances that waterborne diseases or contaminated water or inadequate water provisions could lead to motivation for violence. I think this links back to that war in between Mali and Senegal in the 1980s that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. Having inadequate water supplies could also lower opportunity costs of joining a rebel movement. You could also look at it the other way, and if you have too much, if there's rampant flooding, that makes economic production impractical. It's connecting back to the Waterworld screenshot from a couple of slides ago. That could lower the cost of joining a rebel movement. Risks are highest when scarcity overlaps with political and economic marginalization. I think that was the main takeaway from the Theisen et al. Reading, which we're going to be talking about in the workshop. And this highlights the interactive nature of a lot of these effects connecting water and conflict, that the risk of conflict is highest when there's also pre-existing political or social inequalities or grievances, that the inadequate access to sufficient water could exacerbate subnational conflict. And we're going to see this in the Omo River Basin in Ethiopia and Kenya in next week or the week after. But you can see also we're going to be talking about Central Asia, and I mentioned Mount Kailash and the river systems in Asia. But the Nile, in the readings this week, they showed, I think it was the Gleick article, showed the countries that depend on water sources that have their source outside their country's border. Egypt is by far the highest, with 97% of their water coming from outside the country, specifically through the Nile River system. And you can see a whole bunch of different dams established over over the decades in the 19th and the 20th century that has played a crucial role in economic development in these countries, but it also makes downstream countries vulnerable to what upstream countries do. And we're going to be touching on this with the Kyrgyz and Uzbek example in just a second. And I think this ties back to the international norms and laws that Gleick talks about in his readings, of course, citing the Latin, sic uter tuo ut alienum non laedas. I definitely didn't take Latin, but use your property in a way not to injure others is an international part of international law. It reminds me of an excellent Paul Thomas Anderson movie from Los Angeles, I think, in movies, of There Will Be Blood, in which you have one character played by Daniel Day-Lewis talking about how he had sucked the oil out from underneath the territory of a competing oil baron. And he made the analogy to a milkshake, that you are basically drilling underneath the soil and taking the resources for the milkshake from the other person, and that water tables are uniquely one of those resources that can be drawn out by one group that can affect another group. And just connecting to underwater resources, a lot of them depend on regular water and precipitation. This screenshot from the Theisen article talks about precipitation and drought. We've seen drought over the course of the semester as a drive from Homer Dixon on as a driver of scarcity. But I think it's important to note and to highlight in the readings for this week from the Theisen et al. Reading that some countries have seen an increase in precipitation in the last 5 or 6 decades. It's not a ubiquitous, homogeneous story of lower water resources in the Sahel and in the Omo River that we're going to be looking at next week. There is a lot of spatial variation, and that when we're trying to come up with arguments connecting scarcity and conflict, we have to be careful to actually look at how the patterns vary within countries and between them, because if you just look at the national averages for water availability, you can see some countries that have, like Mozambique, in which you have certain areas that are considerably drier, but then clusters towards the border with Zimbabwe that are considerably wetter. That if you have an average for the entire country, that would wash out some parts that have gotten wetter and some parts that have gotten drier. And so I think the Theisen article, as with the sum of the subnational articles that we've read so far this term, highlight the importance of looking at how things can change or might not be equally distributed within countries as well as between them. The earlier slide that I showed talk about how certain areas in the eastern part of the Horn of Africa, that you do see variation, quite dramatic variation here, though a bit more dated than the current map that I showed you earlier, showed that certain parts of Somalia are much wetter, while other ones are much drier. And also, while we're on Theisen, I think this is another example talking about the difficulties in drawing direct links between environmental scarcity and conflict. Something we've seen Salehan and a bunch of other authors talk about is that there really isn't that much evidence for a direct effect between environmental change and conflict, that it is mediated through political factors, which is why this is a political science class, because political factors and how scarce resources and power is distributed can shape what the likelihood of conflict is, or how people's lives actually are lived in at an individual level. And this also ties into substantive effects in the quantitative models that we've looked at in this class, that I'm not asking you to look at the model specifically, but when I talk about the substantive effect of a lot of these factors, if you looked at this graph From Theisen et al., you see figure 3, relative risk for alternative drought measures. They had a whole bunch of different potential measures of drought to try to see, okay, we think that the political leaders have talked about the importance of water scarcity and conflict, climate change and conflict. So maybe we need to try a bunch of different proxies to see what actually connects it. So look at all these different measures of drought, including severe droughts, number of droughts, distance to droughts, rainfall deviations, which we've seen going back to week 3. And you really don't see any of these lines here. These factors, all these different factors, are only considered statistically significant in the models if one of these confidence intervals, these horizontal lines, do not cross this vertical line at 1, which is the relative risk ratio. If there were coefficients, the line would be at 0. It doesn't really matter. But basically, the only factor that didn't have that confidence interval not crossing the 1 is this measure of economic or ethnic discrimination, the MEG index of excluded groups. That these areas, these cells within a country that had these excluded groups are much more likely to have a conflict onset, which kind of shows you how. And they find evidence for this kind of interactive effect that the drought itself isn't necessarily what matters. Going back to the Buhaug subnational article on India from a few weeks ago, that it really is how these factors intersecting with political factors of marginalization or exclusion that really can connect it to conflict, which is why a lot of the articles this week that we've seen that tie into previous weeks say that it can backfire to focus too much on how climate change might be directly connected to conflict, that it is a multi-step process, and often it is less important than social or existing political ills, that you need to put your attention more towards political or economic development, as well as making people not address the underlying problems that could be leading to these extreme forms of violence. But moving on from that, water and international conflict. We haven't spent that much time talking about international conflict in the class. We did a bit in the week on democratic institutions, but the Gleditsch et al. Article talked about water and international conflict. Rivers can lead to fuzzy boundaries and conflict over territory, in which you have a number of different countries that their international border is separated by a waterway. I think the most dramatic example that I can think of crossing a border would be between Zambia and Zimbabwe, right around Lake Victoria. But rivers can change and they can create fuzzy boundaries, and this conflicts over territory, as one side might want to channel the river in a particular direction, or because of water level change, it could lead to different boundaries. That could be one way. Really not that much evidence in the Gleditsch et al. Article to support that. Another one is water scarcity can lead to conflict over access or equitable distribution, which connects to the Central Asia examples, which I'm going to get to next, that it's the difference between upstream and downstream countries, like with India and Pakistan example, or India and China. And this risk of access conflicts is higher in areas of changing patterns of rainfall or political governments. The changing in governance being relevant to the Political Institutions Week that we covered last month, and changing patterns of rainfall would, of course, change the amount of the pie that needs to be redistributed with water resources. And as with civil conflict, the level of development also matters. That the creation of sanitary facilities, international dams, or ways to try to channel or make the water release more predictable can be shaped by how much the level of development is. And this just kind of connects back to the Homer-Dixon readings from way back, going back to the first parts of the class. Environmental scarcity connects to water resources in the first part by decreasing the quality and quantity of renewable resources. Water, of course, being the most crucial renewable resource. population growth could also mean that there are more people that have to share the same amount or a decreasing amount of water, like with Southern California, or unequal resource access, also like in Southern California, in which you have certain groups prioritized or allocated increasing amounts of water relative to other groups. That could be a source of environmental scarcity, which can lead people to migrate or to move or to face grievances or just not be able to produce as much as possible. So that kind of connects to the Theisen et al. And the Gleditsch et al. Article, as I saw now. One thing also about substantive findings, connecting as I did with that other graph, I wanted to draw your attention to this graph connecting dyadic development between the two states that share a water border or water resource and the probability of a fatal dispute. For those of you who take any kind of international relations classes, you might have be familiar with the MIDS data, the correlates of war data that they use in this paper. And I think this connects to some of the previous readings in which it's important to understand where the effect is actually happening. And so they don't really talk about it that much in this paper, but I saw this and I wanted to draw your attention to it, that you have this substantive effect in which you have countries as they become more developed, they go that way. As both sides become less developed, they go that way. And as you go up on this axis, the more likely you are to have a dispute between these two countries. And these are the two relationships. This black line here is two states that don't have a shared river basin. Their chance of conflict is pretty much consistent at 0.1% any given year having a conflict, because and this light line there is the countries that share a river basin. And what you see is at lower levels of dyadic development and higher levels of dyadic development, you're less likely to have the probability of a dispute than in this area here, kind of in the middle, right? And hopefully that should make us think of the democracy, autocracy, anocracy discussion. I know a lot of students wrote on that for your papers, in which you have this kind of inverted U relationship. But I also wanted to talk about how this relationship is potentially more fragile than you might think because of all this shaded gray area here. That this is the confidence interval, that using statistical methods, which you don't need to understand, what you need to understand, kind of like with a poll for the upcoming election in Australia, there's an amount of uncertainty that you can estimate given how many people you have in your sample or how many cases in your water conflict data set. There is a certain amount of uncertainty around that. Usually 95% is usually the benchmark for that. Here it's a 90% confidence interval, and that you see the only where this relationship is significant between countries that don't share a basin and those that do is only in this really small area in the middle level of development here. That's the area in which they don't overlap. And so when you read these statistics and when you see the fact that that might be significant in some part, you only see this relationship important or statistically significant in this kind of middle area of development. So just something to keep in the back of your mind, and it's going to connect to a question I'm going to ask you in just a second. Speaking of which, let's get to that. So I think in the Gleick article, quite dated now in 1993, but I think as a literature review and an argumentative piece, I think a lot of the themes there are still relevant and has shaped the literature since. There really hasn't been a terrible amount of literature connecting these issues in a broad factor. One is what are the chances of water being a source of rivalry? It's shaped by the degree of scarcity, the extent to which water is shared by one state or region. The more states have to share a resource, the more chances there are for some to come into conflict, or the harder it is to share the common resource, connecting to Olson and the dilemmas of collective action. The relative power of the states involved are important. If you have India and Nepal, or China and Nepal sharing a resource, Nepal is much smaller than China. In any kind of negotiations, the relative power would go a long way to shaping what kind of outcome you're likely to see. ease of alternatives to freshwater sources. If there are competing river systems your country can rely on, it might make one area less likely to have as high a stakes to lead to conflict. And the secondary impact related to water developments. We're going to see this in the Nile River Valley and in Ethiopia, talking about how water developments can have secondary follow-on impacts on neighboring states like Egypt. But anyway, these are a whole bunch of different factors that can shape the probability of water being a source of rivalry. And one of the takeaways is that water is something that can have a relevance on its own, but then more often than not, as we've seen in the cases and in the literature, it is the way that the distribution or the change in the distribution interacts with other political, social, or economic characteristics. So with that, this leads me to my second lecture question, which links to the slide that I just showed you, the confidence intervals and the dispute graph. Do you think the relationship between the degree of scarcity, which I would call X, and water conflict, which is their outcome, their Y, is that relationship linear, i.e. the relationship can be plotted on a straight line, or is it nonlinear? Is the relationship more like a U or an upside down U, right? Kind of like that Gleditsch article there. So do they estimate it in a way that's nonlinear? Is there ways or a research gap that you can find in the literature? What do you think is the most direct relationship between scarcity and conflict? And can you draw any kind of links to explain why that would be the case based on your knowledge of what we've already covered this semester? And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn next to a couple of really interesting, if dated and not necessarily the highest quality videos, looking at water disputes between people in Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. In this class, I tried to balance including highly visible cases like the Syrian conflict and ones that are less so, like with this in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, two countries that became incredibly important to the West during the Afghan conflict and have now arguably received less attention. So let's turn it over to these two videos from 2009, a bit dated now, as well as an updated video a decade later from Al Jazeera, and then we'll turn to talking about them in a bit more detail after you watch those. So see you soon.